Most elections are pretty straightforward, right? One party's in, the other's out. But every now and then, one comes along that's more like a political earthquake. An event that doesn't just swap who's in charge, but completely redraws the whole map. Well, the British general election of 1906 was one of those moments. It was a massive shock that sent tremors right through the establishment and set the stage for the next 100 years of political fights. I mean, just look at these numbers. This wasn't just a win, it was an absolute demolition. The Liberals stormed into power with an incredible 400 seats. The Conservatives, on the other hand, the party that had pretty much dominated British politics for a century, were absolutely crushed, smashed down to just 157 seats. It was a total rejection of the old government. And you'll notice the other key players here, the Irish nationalists still holding a lot of sway, and this brand new force, the Labour Representation Committee, grabbing a solid foothold with 30 seats. Their story, as we'll see, is just getting started. And if you want to understand just how stunned the old guard was, you have to read this quote from the defeated Prime Minister Arthur Balfour. He was so completely blindsided, he couldn't even make sense of it in normal political terms. Just think about that for a second. He's comparing a democratic election in Britain to revolutionary massacres in Russia. It perfectly captures how disconnected, how out of touch the old aristocratic ruling class was with the mood of the country. So that leads us to the first huge question. How on earth did this happen? How did the political giant of the time, the Conservative Party, suffer such a catastrophic, earth-shattering defeat? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was more like a perfect storm of problems. You had lingering anger from the Boer War, you had fury from major church groups over an Education Act, and frankly, you had pretty weak leadership. But the real killer, the self-inflicted wound that tore the party in two, was a single explosive idea: tariff reform. The entire election really boiled down to this huge fight between two simple but incredibly powerful ideas. The Liberals championed free trade, with what they called the big loaf, promising it would keep food cheap for working families. On the other side, a really strong group within the Conservatives pushed for tariff reform, basically taxes on imported goods. Now, they argued it would protect British jobs, but the Liberals, in a stroke of genius, branded it the small loaf. And that message was simple. This means your food is going to get more expensive. It was a classic bread and butter issue, and it worked perfectly. It united the Liberals while it just ripped the Conservatives to shreds. And to really get what was driving this tariff reform idea, you have to listen to the man himself, Joseph Chamberlain. For him, this wasn't just about economics. No, this was a massive, grand vision for the British Empire. He wanted to tie the whole empire together with trade, to protect it from rivals like Germany and America. But here's the thing. He's brutally honest about the cost. He says it right there. In return, we must tax food. He was making a huge bet that voters would choose imperial glory and job security over a cheap loaf of bread. And in 1906, he found out he had bet completely and disastrously wrong. But this political earthquake wasn't just about destruction. The Conservative collapse wasn't the only story. Something new was being created in the rubble. A totally different force was walking onto the political stage. And it was one that would come to define the next century. For this part of the story, the number you need to remember is this one: 30. Now, okay, 30 might not sound like a lot next to the Liberals' 400 seats, right? But for a party that basically didn't exist a few years before, winning 30 seats in the House of Commons was, well, it was absolutely massive. This was the moment the Labour Party truly arrived. So, who were these guys? The Labour Representation Committee, or the LRC. They were a totally new kind of political force. This wasn't a party born in fancy London clubs. Nope. It was forged in the trade unions, in the socialist societies of industrial Britain. And their goal? It was simple, but at the time, totally revolutionary. Get actual working men, like their leader, the Scottish miner Keir Hardie, into the halls of Parliament to fight for their class. So how did they pull it off? How did they make this breakthrough? Well, it wasn't just about winning arguments. A huge piece of the puzzle was a really clever and very secret backroom deal, the Lib Lab Pact. This was just pure smart politics. The Liberals and Labour basically agreed not to fight each other in key seats to make sure the anti-conservative vote wasn't split. This pact is what gave Labour its first real open door into Parliament. And this is a really crucial point to grasp about what happened right after this election. Yes, Labour had its foot in the door. But let's be clear, they were very much the junior partner. They were part of this bigger progressive alliance, and for now, their survival and their influence really depended on the goodwill of that massive Liberal majority. Their journey to actually becoming a main party of government, that was still a long, long way off.
Right, because this election wasn't just people voting against the Conservatives. The massive size of the Liberal win was seen as a huge thumbs up for something totally new. It was a mandate for a whole new era of reform, one that was going to completely change the relationship between the British state and its citizens.
And the big idea powering all this was something called New Liberalism. This was a huge break from the old school laissez-faire thinking, the idea that the government should just stay out of things. Instead, these new liberals said, hey, real freedom isn't just about being left alone. It's freedom from the big problems of the day: poverty, poor health, not having a job. And for the first time, a major party was arguing that the state had a moral duty to step in and help people.
And boy, did they get to work. You can just feel the energy coming off this new government when you look at the laws they started passing. Just look at this timeline. Bang, 1908, you get the Old Age Pensions Act, a massive first step. Then just a year later, bam, 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 minimum wages in some industries and job centers to help the unemployed. And it all builds up to this massive showdown in 1909, the famous People's Budget, which basically tried to make the wealthy pay for it all. This was the birth of the British welfare state, happening right here.
So let's pull back. What was the long-term aftershock of this 1906 earthquake? It did more than just create a new government. It created a whole new political world, and it drew the battle lines for the entire 20th century. The whole conversation in British politics just shifted. Before 1906, what were politicians arguing about? The empire, those tariffs we talked about, Ireland. After 1906, the conversation completely pivoted. Now the big arguments were about social welfare, about what the government's proper role should be, and crucially, about the power of the unelected House of Lords to block the changes people had voted for. 1906 was a turning point. And here's the really wild irony of it all. In this moment of their greatest victory, the Liberals were also sowing the seeds of their own eventual decline. By smashing the old conservative order and opening the door for Labour, they changed the political map forever. This election kicked off the long, slow process that would eventually see the Labour Party replace the Liberals as the main challenger to the Conservatives, creating the two-party system that dominated Britain for the next century. Which leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. The Liberals had won a historic landslide victory. They had this bold new vision for Britain. But the forces of the old world weren't defeated, not by a long shot. The House of Lords was spoiling for a fight, industrial unrest was growing, and looming over everything, the shadow of war was gathering in Europe. So yeah, the Liberals won the Battle of 1906 in a landslide. But the war to define the 20th century, that was just getting started.